Awesome. Welcome, everybody. My name is Gabriel. I'm Assistant Director of the Denver Project for Humanistic Inquiry, the Humanities Center here on campus. I just wanted to welcome you all to Ukraine Conflict in Context. It's a follow-up panel to one we had a few years ago. And I wanted to let everybody online know, if you are watching for extra credit, you will need to complete the QR code or the survey from the QR code that's in the PowerPoint. So make sure you stick around for that. And from here, I'd just like to thank the Departments of Political Science and History for making this event possible, especially Dr. Maestrejuan for being so instrumental, and our own Sheila Rucki Professor of Political Science here at MSU Denver. So I'll let Sheila jump in and introduce our speakers for today.
Well, thank you very much. My name is Sheila Rucki, and I am a professor of political science, and it's my honor to be able to introduce our two speakers for today. Our first speaker will be Ferenc Németh. Is that how it's pronounced? I'm sorry. Ferenc is a PhD candidate at Corvinus University of Budapest and a visiting fellow at the University of Toronto Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. You've conducted research across Europe, including St. Cyril, Methodist University, and you've pursued postgraduate studies in Graz and Belgrade. You've had over a decade of experience in applied research, advocacy, and journalism. You've held roles at the Hungarian Institute of International Affairs, and there's a long list of roles you've had. It's a very impressive list, none of the words I would be able to pronounce, so despite my 3 weeks of Hungarian language instruction. Let's see. Your work focuses on the Western Balkans, Central Europe, EU enlargement, and security studies, and you've presented at major international forums and academic conferences across Europe and North America, and we are so happy to have you here today.
Thank you very much. The pleasure is mine. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for being here. To be honest with you, okay, how to operate this?
Spacebar again?
It's not about Ukraine per se, but a lot that I'm going to talk about has something to do with the global world order, how the future of Ukraine would look like, how the future of, let's say, US and Russian relations would shape the Western Balkans, which is my research topic. So when it comes to, let's say, my 20-minute presentation, consequences of not enlarging the European Union towards the Western Balkans, and how all that relates to the second presidency of Donald Trump. It's the right key, this is the right, yeah. So first, let me do some conceptualization. What is the Western Balkans exactly? It's not a geopolitical region, it's not a geographical region, but rather integration as such. Some of them are already members of the NATO alliance, including Montenegro, Albania, as well as North Macedonia. So this is the region, this is the Western Balkans that I'm going to talk about. In short, this is mainly a political term, not a geographical one that consists of currently 6 countries. and I would like to highlight what the Trump 2.0 might bring to the table or to the Western Balkans. So what I can tell you about the American diplomacy or American engagement over the Western Balkans is that it has changed a lot over the course of the last three and a half decades. The US has always played a significant role in the region. It has been characterized as one of the major to successfully resolve the diplomatic as well as armed conflicts of the 1990s. The 1990s in the Western Balkans were characterized by armed conflict. That was a period of hostilities that accompanied the over the course of the end of the 1990s, but especially after 9/11, the foreign policy focus of the USA has significantly shifted. In other words, especially after 9/11, the USA had bigger fish to fry, especially in the Middle East, than later on under Obama in China and in other parts of the completely, but rather when it comes to its military presence, when it comes to its diplomatic forces, it has still maintained a strong presence, accompanied by additional presence by the European Union. And this is how we entered the first Trump presidency. There weren't any major steps taken by the first Trump administration in order to resolve the ongoing bilateral issues or unresolved issues as such in the region. Only during the final months, thank you so much, of the first Trump presidency saw some diplomatic efforts taken in order to resolve the ongoing Serbia-Kosovo normalization process unsuccessfully. Flash forward to 2 months ago, with the return of Donald Trump to the White House, there have been a lot of expectations from local leaders, especially from the leaders of Serbia, North Macedonia, and to some extent Bosnia-Herzegovina's Republika Srpska, that with the arrival of Donald Trump back to the White House, he is going to have a more of a preferential treatment over their positions that are many times pro-Russian and pro-Chinese. And basically, this is the situation where we are now. The expectations are still there, but as of now, I cannot really identify or pinpoint any activities coming from the US or US embassies in the Western Balkans that would allude to the fact that those expectations are being met. And there are obviously two reasons behind that. The first is very simple. The Western Balkans is still not high on the American foreign policy agenda. And you know it better than me that now the White House is pretty much occupied with Ukraine, first and foremost, and secondly on the Middle East. And secondly, it would be a silly decision, pardon my French, to mingle in the Western Balkans in a way that would harm the security framework that has actually been established by the USA in the 1990s, not only established but maintained throughout the decades. And there is this fear coming from European capitals, EU capitals, that with the return of Donald Trump and with his leader-to-leader shady business cooperation mechanisms, he might actually be very harmful to the region's security architecture as such, because he wouldn't shy away from making shady deals behind closed doors, not only shady deals but very swift deals behind closed doors, just in order to gain some either foreign policy or domestic political capitals from it. So there are some fears coming from the European Union that if Trump does something in the Western Balkans, especially in Bosnia or Kosovo, then it is going to be the European Union that needs to take care of the mess, the potential mess, obviously. But so far, and obviously it's only been 2 months since Trump is back in power, I don't see any, let's say, like major signs or any signs that US diplomacy and foreign policy towards the Western Balkans has changed for the worse or the better. So that's a good sign. The bad sign is the EU's engagement in the Western Balkans and enlargement of the European Union towards the Western Balkans. Why I'm saying this? Enlargement has all EU enlargement. So the accession of new countries to the European Union has always been labeled as the most successful EU policy since the birth of the European Union. But in the past, more than a decade or so, there have been no enlargement. There have been so-called enlargement fatigue coming from Western European EU member states, which means that they are very much tired of having new member states, having to welcome new member states at the European Union. And also the countries of the Western Balkans, or shall I say the political elites of the Western Balkans, are very much reluctant to undergo the internal reforms that are very much needed to have them join the European Union anytime soon. So when it comes to the more successful EU policy, that is EU enlargement, there are no possible ways to move forward as of now, because a lot of member states as well as candidate countries from the Western Balkans aren't doing their due diligence or their job properly in order to be ready for accession. And this is this situation with the unpredictabilities that comes with Trump and the basically non-existent offer of EU enlargement puts the Western Balkans in dangerous risks. The region itself has always been at the crossroads of foreign policy interest, great power competition, and with the possibility of the changing role of the USA, as well as the reluctance of the EU to welcome these countries to the European Union, the Western Balkans has once again been put in a limbo, which would enter the door for heightened foreign influence coming from the East, namely from the direction of Russia, China, or the Gulf states as well. That was actually 3 years ago, the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, when we in Europe thought that this is going to be a game changer also for enlargement towards the Western Balkans, because the full-scale invasion has been such a major shock, not only in Europe, but globally. And we really hope that that would serve as a wake-up call, as a strong realization that enlargement is also a geopolitical tool in order to combat malign influence, in order to provide security not only for the region, not only for the Western Balkans, but for the entire continent as well. So we had very high hopes that this realization will actually lead to results. But here we are in 2025, 3 years after the full-scale invasion, and only very small, very minor, basically non-existent steps have been taken with regards to EU enlargement towards the Western Balkans, because once again, there is no real appetite either from EU members, the majority of member states, but also from the political elites of the Western Balkans to join forces together and work for a common goal, and that is full-fledged EU membership. So what we can see now is a clear, let's say, like borderline abandonment of this political willingness of the European Union and the Western Balkans to have to have them join the European Union. And this kind of political membership, what we can see in recent years, but especially in the last year or so, is that we are moving toward a lighter form of integration that is only in the field of economic cooperation, which is very much important as well. And I do believe that economic integration can one day spill over to political fields, but maybe that is going to be later. And in order to secure the Western Balkans and its security composure, economic integration is definitely not enough. What the EU need and what the Western Balkan needs is full political membership at the European Union, especially in a world that is very much characterized by uncertainties, global and regional power competition and rivalries, and above all, a very rapidly changing shift in global order and politics. So the situation is not is gloomy, to say the least. Either if I look at the Western Balkans from an American point of view because of the uncertainties with Trump, and also if I look at it from an EU perspective because of the lack of willingness to undergo with the integration of the Western Balkans into the EU. And although I don't like to be very negative when I do a presentation, I'm more of a glass is half full kind of researcher, but this is how I'm going to finish this presentation, and hopefully the questions and the brainstorming is going to be a bit more positive than my presentation. So thank you very much for your attention, and if you have any questions, comments, feel free to share with the group. Thank you.
Thank you. Does anyone have any questions?
Yeah.
Before you answer, could you repeat the question for the folks?
Yeah, sure. No, are you going to repeat the question, or shall I paraphrase it? Yeah. So thank you so much. So basically, your question is about whether Trump can somehow negatively impact the Kosovo-Serbia balance, or be, let's say, like on the side of Serbia when it comes to the normalization of relations or the statehood of Kosovo. Absolutely. I mean, this is what we can see. I mean, when it comes to leader-to-leader relations, Trump has good relations to the president of Serbia, and the entire White House, and I'm not going to, exaggerate, loads the current Kosovo government because of many reasons, and we can discuss that later as well. So when it comes from a Kosovo point of view, they are going to have pretty hard years to come if Trump wanted to do something with regards to Serbia and Kosovo. On the other hand, I don't really think that no matter how Trump's foreign policy towards the Western Balkans turns out, that is not going to impact Kosovo's statehood. I don't see a scenario. I cannot see a scenario in which the U.S. put Kosovo's sovereignty or its international recognition into jeopardy, because once again, this is something that the U.S. has put significant political economic and military capital ever since the end of the 1990s. The biggest risk when it comes to, let's say, a closed door compromise made with or without Kosovo's knowledge or acceptance is basically I don't think that a scenario like that would actually lead to, let's say, the reintegration of Kosovo to Serbia, because that is impossible now. Kosovo is a political reality, and even Serbia recognizes that. Not on paper, not in front of media. Their politicians wouldn't say that out loud, but deep in their heart, they know that for them, Kosovo is a lost cause. And the U.S. it will remain. I truly. The U.S. will definitely remain a supporter of the Kosovo cause, but maybe wouldn't be in favor of this current government.
Before you ask a question, hit the red button on the bottom of the microphone, please, and talk into it.
Is there a short answer to the question of why Yugoslavia could not continue as a single country?
There is no short answer, but I'm going to be very short. There are so many reasons. A lot of researchers point out, the rising nationalisms, the global changes that took place that part of Europe, the collapse of the Soviet Union, or let's say the political changes in Central and Eastern Europe. But I think the real reason is more of economic nature. Yugoslavia in the 1980s went down in a economic spiral, which triggered a lot of nationalisms, because it was easy to blame your neighbor for your problems rather than facing the economic hardships, let alone resolve it. And it is always easy to put a blind eye to economic problems and spark up and create non-existent problems. And I really perceive, let's say, the alleged feud between Serbs and Croats, Kosovo Albanians and Serbs, as something that politicians manufactured back in the day in order for them not to have to deal with the economic state of the country. And that, after a while, led to armed conflict, which led to the disintegration of Yugoslavia. That wasn't short either, but shorter than what I usually answer to this question.
Are there any other questions? Yes.
Would you be willing to comment on this weird triangle between the United States, the EU, and NATO?
Sure. Which is going to be definitely my personal opinion or whatsoever. I don't think the current administration likes the EU, period. Full stop.
Yeah, that's clear.
And which means that I think this disdain comes from the fact that they see the European Union as an entity that can function better than the US in many policy fields, including, let's say, like social policies and healthcare. So I think there is a lot of jealousy attached to this hatred or disdain. Hatred might be a very strong word to use. And when it comes to NATO, it has been a problem for many years in the past as well, is that the US wants to have the European NATO members to contribute more to defense spending. And it started under the first Trump presidency, and Europe delivered. I mean, most of the European countries delivered. But there are more demands, and that is not going to be easy, let alone possible, for a lot of European NATO members to achieve, which eventually will alienate the White House even more from its European allies. So I don't. Once again, I tend to be positive, but when it comes to this triangle, especially the White House's relations towards the EU and European members of NATO, I don't see any positive signs for the future to come. I don't see how European allies, most of the European allies, can increase their defense spendings anymore. Because even to have 2% of their GDP spent on defense spendings were difficult in many cases. And I don't see the EU basically kissing the ring. I don't see a scenario when European leaders would willingly kiss the ring of anyone in the White House. But rather, I would say is that for fire, they will respond with fire.
And Germany seems to be, thank you. Germany seems to be willing to adjust to rearm, at least unilaterally, with regards to other EU nations.
And I perceive it as something good because Germany used to be the leading country of the EU, both economically but also politically. And in the last few years, especially after the full-scale invasion, the European Union lost its basically number one political player, Germany, the country that would lead the entire group to the next step. And now I feel like with this new incoming German leadership, we might get that kind of guidance back, what we need from Germany.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions? Well, thank you so much. I have questions about China's penetration, but we can talk about that later.
Sure.
All right, our next speaker is Sándor Seremet. He is a senior research fellow at the Hungarian Institute of International Affairs and an expert at the Eurasian Center of the John von Neumann University. You're a historian by training, but I won't hold that against you. And you completed your PhD at the Pazme Peter Catholic University, focusing on the border formation of present-day Transcarpathia after World War I. You've had research positions at the House of Terror Museum, which I've visited, and it's terrifying. And the Charles University in Prague as a Visegrad Fund Scholar, and since 2020, he's been affiliated with the Institute for Foreign Affairs and Trade. His research centers on the political and economic dynamics of post-Soviet countries, particularly Ukraine, Russia, Belarus, and the Caucasus, and you've published extensively both in Hungarian and English. And we are so happy to have you here.
Thank you very much. It's a great honor for me to be here. I'm going to be talking about the society of Ukraine, whether it's united or not, how fractured it is, or it is not. Probably I will not be that structured as my dear friend Ferenc was, but I'm going to do my best to keep it nice and tidy. So before we're going to dive deep into the topic, briefly what we're going to talk about. First, we will see how Ukraine was built and what determined its society to be how it is today. And then we will see a couple of case studies on particular issues that affect most severely the Ukrainian society after certain events that happened after the dissolution of the Soviet Union. So I would start with, all right. I will start with a phrase from an article of 2010 that was written after the election of one of the pro-Russian presidents of Ukraine, Viktor Yanukovych, one of the Ukrainian authors who was very dedicated to the Western integration of Ukraine and was focusing on the new nation building in Ukraine, wrote in an article 2010 that was entitled Two Ukraines, Three Ukraines, or One Ukraine. So while the voters of the West and Central Ukraine mostly identify themselves as Ukrainians, they consider the statehood and sovereignty of Ukraine to be the most important value, while the motivations of the voters in the East and the South are somewhat different. This second part includes those who do not accept Ukrainian statehood, mostly Crimea, in some context Odessa, and those who still have not came out of the ice age of the Soviet rule, Donetsk, Luhansk, Kharkiv, Kherson, Mykolaiv counties. The western and central areas are therefore the Ukrainian Ukraine. For years, they have been voting based on worldview and ideological motivations. Figuratively, for Ukraine, its destiny, its honor, its glory, its people. The other part, relatively anti-Ukrainian Ukraine, Crimea and Odessa, has also been voting based on worldview and ideological motivations for years, but those are not pro-Ukrainian. As for the east, especially the Donetsk and Luhansk regions, this is the post-Soviet Ukraine, which has started voting solely based on socioeconomic incentives. So what that means, the Ukrainian nation builders and those who became the political elite believe that if somebody in Ukraine, like Crimea and Odessa, have different worldviews, so they're not necessarily pro-Ukrainian, they belong to, let's say, the pro-Russian sphere of the Ukrainian society. Why those who are living in the industrial parts of Ukraine, the post-Soviet Ukraine, are voting the socioeconomic incentives, what they mean is that they don't really care who is the political leader of the Ukraine and what's going to be the destiny or the path of the country, as long as they can afford to buy their food and keep their lives on cheap prices. So basically, in 2010, we see that in the view of the progressive Ukrainian elite, they see three groups within Ukraine. And the Ukrainian politicians, basically since the dissolution of the Soviet Union, but mostly from the beginning of the 2000s, are riding these differences between the various regions and groups in Ukraine and gaining their political leverage from these differences, meaning that I will support your views if you are going to give your votes to me. It comes from the variety of Ukrainian regions and from the different historical background of these very regions. On this map, you can see from by different colors what parts of Ukraine were joined to today's Ukraine during the history. So the very green one in the middle is the part that was developing under the rule of the Russian Empire. The yellows on the northwest are the territories that belong to Poland and prior to that to the Austrian monarchy. The very west part was part of Hungary, then Czechoslovakia. The browns one coming from Romania, and the Crimea is a totally different case coming from various territories of Tatars, Ottomans, Russian Empire, then the Soviet Union, and now it is being under occupation. If you look at this map and compare it with the next one, which is the ethno-linguistic map of Ukraine, then it gives you a hint on how Ukraine is composed from point of view of the languages that are being used, not only in the households, but also in the daily life of the Ukrainian population. There's a significant difference in the south and the east of Ukraine, where you can see that little yellowish or brownish territories where predominantly Russian speakers live, and with the brown stripes are the territories where the ethnic Russians live. This is very important to understand that in Ukraine, those who are speaking Russian are not necessarily ethnically Russians. There's a huge amount of Ukrainians who believe that they are Ukrainians and they ethnically Ukrainians, but in their homes and in their daily life, they use the Russian language as their primary language. And it wasn't a big problem until 2013 and 14 when the Revolution of Dignity took place. Later on, the question of language in Ukraine became a question of state security, meaning that those who prefer to speak Russian, they might be victims, or they can fall easily under the influence of the so-called Russian world, or Ruski Mir, that can spread its information and propaganda through their media outlets. And those can, and later when the events in the Crimea, and the eastern Ukraine arose, then these cases were used as a proof to that. By these differences, meaning to the language or historic background, we can also include religion in here, but that would be a little bit far from the topic that we're talking about, formulates the political preferences of the Ukrainians. This is an old map from 2004. This was the very first election that showed these differences of the Ukrainian society that that led to a deeper division of Ukraine. So as you can understand, the more orange colors are the ones who were voted for the pro-Western President Viktor Yushchenko, while the bluish, purplish ones are those who voted to the pro-Russian candidate. And basically this division remains even today, and you can see it in various matters. We're going to get to this a little bit later. So here are the case studies that I wanted to mention. As I said, that there's a very important event in the Ukrainian history, especially after gaining independence, the Revolution of Dignity that happened in 2014. Basically, this was the time when Ukraine decisively took the Western turn and set its path towards the integration with the Western structures and chose the path to the Euro-Atlantic integration. And after that, a very strong effort was put into the so-called political nation building of Ukraine, where a unified, politically solid Ukrainian nation has to be born and has to be established. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to translate the Ukrainian text on the side, but I'll translate it. So basically, the first question in August 2020 was how you would assess the results of the Revolution of Dignity in 2014 as something good or something bad, or you basically cannot choose between the two. So in 2020, totally the 54% of the Ukrainians said that the revolution was something good. In west and the central parts of Ukraine, this percentage was 87 and 64, while on the south and the east, only 23% of the population said that it was something good. If they were asked whether it's something bad, then you can see how high the numbers are, again, on those Russian-speaking territories of the south and the east. That was in 2020. The lower part shows the cases that were done in 2022, and you can see a serious backdrop in this, meaning that after the invasion of Russia to Ukraine, these political differences became less significant. And there is a very simple explanation to that. After the Russian invasion, the, let's say, pro-Russian part of Ukraine lost its ground because they felt betrayed, and actually everything in which they believed before that kind of collapsed. And if you would listen to some Western political commentators, they would say that the Russian invasion of Ukraine basically created the Ukrainian nation, which I doubt, because that Ukrainian nation was there for a long time before that war. The other thing is that it's kind of integrated it to the levels that were not seen before, because the appearance of the new common enemy allowed the Ukrainians to kind of put under the rug the problems that were inside Ukraine for a long time. Another case study that would demonstrate the changes in the political thinking and the thinking of the historic heritage, let's say, in Ukraine, is the renaming and the changing of the names of cities, streets, and other places within Ukraine, depending on whether they have some connections with the Russian culture or they don't. So if you would see the two maps, then you can graphs, then you can see that in Ukraine, the Russian speakers are those who are assessing the situation as something negative. Totally in Ukraine, and if you go to the south and the east of Ukraine, it's even more significantly visible if you compare it between the Russian speakers and Ukrainian speakers. This is a poll about the situation of Ukraine in general that was conducted today. That shows that 49% of the population says that Ukraine's matters are going in the wrong direction in Ukraine. And this is an American one that was done in 2024 about the visions of Ukrainians about the ending of the war. So you can see that after 2 years of the war, those who would support the continuation of the war decreased to 38%, yet those who would like to end the war as soon as possible rose to 52%, which is visible in the map of 2022. The further from the front you are, the higher the amount of the people who would continue the war until the victory was in 2022. Yet in 2024, it all decreased to a very low level, depending on, again, how far from the front the people are living. So these are the case studies in general, but now let's put things in context a little bit. So the outbreak of the Russo-Ukrainian war created, let's say, good conditions for the Ukrainian society to integrate and to stand up together for something that possesses a threat to the existence of Ukraine and Ukrainian nation itself. The problem with that is that after 2 years of the full-scale invasion, the war in Ukraine unfortunately became a routine. And since this routine became part of the daily life of the Ukrainians, and it seems that the internal political processes are now being revived since the elections are not that far from being held, the political elites of Ukraine are starting to use these political differences and socio-ethnical fractures in Ukraine in order to gain their political leverage in the upcoming elections. Today we can see that these issues that are related to the political preferences of the certain parts of population, the language that they would like to use, or the religious matters to which certain groups of the population are sticking to, becoming new problems again. By this, I mean that, for example, it is problematic again if the soldiers on the front are speaking Russian to each other. Years ago, the main line in this communication was it doesn't matter what language you speak until you're protecting your country and you're giving your blood for the freedom of Ukraine. Now it is again on the agenda that if you're speaking Russian, then you shouldn't serve in the armed forces because you might be a traitor who would join the Russian forces, which creates a certain frustration in the society and in the military as well. This is not a good tendency for a country being in war, especially if the war will end in the upcoming months or years. These problems are going to erupt in the Ukrainian society with way bigger significance than they used to be before. In my opinion, Ukraine's partners and even the leaders of Ukraine are paying not enough attention to this problem in the Ukrainian society, especially with the element of the frustration that the Ukrainian society faces today. And we don't know how it will continue after the war will end, and when this external enemy that keeps the Ukrainian society together now will disappear. So many of the experts believe that there are serious threats within the Ukrainian society in the post-war period that the partners of Ukraine and the leaders of Ukraine are not prepared to take care of at this point. It is a gloomy conclusion at this point, unfortunately, but I think that the more we address and speak about these problems, maybe some of the decision makers and those who have power will at least pay some attention to these problems and would decide to give a chance to heal Ukraine rather than to keep it running into the abyss on the way it is today. So if you have any questions regarding the Ukrainian society in general and the state of the war in Ukraine, I am more than happy to answer them. Thank you.
Thank you very much. If you can pass the microphone down. Thank you.
Could you briefly explain why Odessa and the far south of Ukraine are so pro-Russian, and maybe like why Russia pulled out in the early stages of the invasion?
Yeah. So to name those territories pro-Russian wouldn't be the best case. It's a very simplifying term to use, but this is something that we use in order to be able to keep track on the things. Historically, it was logical that those territories are going to be more pro-Russian than the others. First of all, due to the legacy of the Russian Empire, since the majority of the cities over there were built during the Russian Empire. Later on, these territories became the key industrial territories of Ukraine, and it was populated mostly by either Ukrainians who were living on those territories or Russians who moved there and kind of worked on those territories. So this is not only a part of Ukraine where there is a significant part of Russian speakers, but also there's many ethnically Russian people. The Crimea is a totally different case because it used to belong to the Russians, and then it was attached to Ukraine, and then occupied again by the Russians. But culturally, religiously, linguistically, these territories were more integrated with the Russian culture and with the Russian language. And in the Soviet era, through this proletarian unity and this industrial and technical intelligentsia, they had a lot in common, especially due to the fact that the military-industrial complex was very tightly linked with those Ukrainian companies or firms and factories that were placed in the south and the east of Ukraine. So basically, this created a very serious link between the two. And after the Revolution of Dignity, when these problems or these conditions were not in favor of the new Ukrainian leadership, due to the well-known issues that these language things were turned to security matters, in many cases, the population of these regions felt themselves as unwanted in the new Ukraine, and they saw in the Russians or in the Russian culture some sort of a refuge of their identity in a way. But it doesn't mean that they would have any separatist tendencies or they would want to break away from Ukraine. They just wanted to remain those kind of Ukrainians that they always been in Ukraine and not being mugged or bullied due to their linguistical preferences. And the other question was why the Russians pulled out from Kiev, you mean? Yeah. I understand. You mean the territories of Kherson, for example? So they withdrew behind the Dnieper River. Well, that's shown how the Russians were unprepared to build their defense on the other side of the river. So they were just military not prepared to keep their strongholds on the other side of the river. Yet, if you look at the documentation and the papers that they signed and the declarations that they declared, they want to keep all the four regions within their administrative borders, and those in many cases reach far beyond the Dnipro River. I don't see that in these conditions in which they would be capable militarily to take them over like this. Maybe they will be able to reach the administrative borders of Donetsk and Luhansk, those territories where they are declared their independence, and they believe that they have some ideological leverage over there, but this will not be the case in Kherson and Dnipropetrovsk.
How do you think that the relationship with the leader of Ukraine and ours, that I know, we all saw how them meeting at the White House went, how do you think that will affect the ongoing conflict? Which I know none of us can tell the future, but I guess your opinion.
Yeah, I forgot my crystal ball back in the hotel, so I cannot give that clear answer in that. I think that conflict that happened in the White House, it gave President Zelensky certain leverage in Ukraine, because in the late couple of months, maybe in the last year, his popularity went a little bit down. And after this conflict, his popularity recovered, and recovered significantly if we believe the polls that are being conducted, because we have to understand that it's very hard to do polls in Ukraine. People who are dealing with it, they say that only 20% of the people they reach out are ready to respond. And even those who are responding, they're thinking through very carefully what they're saying, because it's a country in war. So being negative towards the political leadership, is not the best thing in Ukraine. And there were problems with that. But, we have to understand that this is a specific situation in Ukraine. The problem with the conflict in the White House, but in general, the conflict of Ukraine and the new U.S. administration, is that the Ukrainians, especially President Zelensky, he still is in the belief that he is the only fortress that keeps the Russian hordes from Europe, and he does not really calculate the element that how dependent Ukraine is on the Western support. And Europe solely will not be able to keep Ukraine running without American help. The Americans' approach to Ukraine turned out to be a little bit more business-oriented, with this mineral deal and the deal on the nuclear power plants and the maintenance and the infrastructure matters in Ukraine. So the Ukrainians believed in the previous times that if they would offer the Trump administration chunks of the Ukrainian, let's say, leverages that they have, then the Americans will be more motivated to protect Ukraine, or even to help Ukraine to fight the Russians out of the territories where the most significant resources are placed. But this turned out a little bit differently, because the American approach in here was that, okay, give us what you have, we will see how we can work with that, and you guys better stop, because it will harm our business interest in Ukraine. So if you look at the situation from this perspective, then on one hand, it may lead to a quicker closure of the war, which would be in favor at least 60% of Ukrainian population. But on the other hand, it would harm the international political order, and it would harm the territorial integrity of Ukraine, which would lead to those problems that I mentioned in my presentation, that a disappointed, alienated Ukraine with an army armed to the teeth is not something that the European Union and even America is prepared to deal with. Thank you.
Are there any other questions? Oh, yes, absolutely.
Is Russia's goal to annex all of Ukraine? And does this conflict inevitably end with some kind of redrawn border with a smaller Ukraine, and is that sustainable?
That's a very good question. The first part is easy. Russia does not want to annex the entire Ukraine, because it will not be able to sustain it. Russia will not be able to take over Ukraine entirely, but even if it would be able to do it militarily, it will not be able to keep the power in Ukraine after that, because with that amount of hostile population in Ukraine, it would be a second for Russia, which they cannot handle. The territories that they have already is a little bit easier, because you cannot see any resistance movements over there. You cannot see any partisans fighting the Russian. In the Crimea, Odessa is not under Russian rule, and it will not be. It's too precious. It's the biggest port, and I think since the Americans has interest in the port infrastructure of Ukraine, logistics infrastructure in Ukraine, Odessa will not fall to the Russians' hands. It might be the case that Odessa will not be that hostile to the Russians if it be under Russian control, but it's not something that could happen in the near future. So with regard to the redrawing the borders, what we hear today from experts that are dealing with the dissolution dealing with the solution of the war in Ukraine, they predict that Ukraine will have to give up these territories, but not on paper. So they would give up the attempts of getting back these territories by military force or diplomatic force, but they will not be forced to recognize them, that these territories are going to be under Russian sovereignty. It's something like Japan has with Russia, right? So they do not recognize the territories, those islands that the Russians possess, but they don't recognize them, but they don't use any diplomatic or military force to get them back. So this is sort of a status quo, but they keep running their businesses and deals. Something similar to that happened also with the Baltics after World War II. So the Baltics were incorporated to the Soviet Union, but they never were recognized as Soviet territory by the Western Allies. Yet they were able to work together with the Soviets. I think this can be the scenario for the war in Ukraine as well. So no one will recognize these territories as Russians, but they will freeze it as it is. Because if they would recognize them as Russian, then it would mean that by military force, certain powers can redraw the borders in the world, which would lead to very unpredictable consequences. Russia is not the only country in the world who wants to change borders.
Jump in.
If I may. Thank you. If I may, this is not a scripted question. My question would take the conversation back to the White House. My so-called echo chamber or opinion silo tells me that there are serious double standards with regards to how Trump treats Ukraine or the Ukrainian leadership and how Trump treats Putin. Would you agree with this? Are there double standards? Do you see any double standards? And if so, what can be the potential reasons why Trump seems to favor Putin over Zelensky?
I thought we were friends, Ferry, but I thought we were friends. That's a very tough question to answer. Some say that Putin and Trump have sort of a chemistry that comes from a long time ago, and since Trump behaves with Putin with respect and talks down to Zelensky, we can see that that's true in a way. I think that the relations of the U.S., the new U.S. administration and the administration in Kiev is based on the provided services. So Ukraine received a lot of support from the United States, and the new administration, in my opinion, believes that Ukraine must behave in a more humble way if it communicates with the most significant donor and partner of Ukraine. It is not necessarily the best way to describe it, but Zelensky was kept for a long time in a very warm bath because all the world leaders were going to Kiev, shaking his hands, giving hugs to him, and wanted to have a picture with him in a bunker or somewhere in Kiev. And that allowed Zelensky to behave more confidently, I would say. And if you run into someone who believes that he's running the world, as President Trump does, you have to be prepared to get another set of skills or set of not skills but set of behavioral manners that you could use in order to have some good relations with him. And I think the team of Zelensky made a mistake by not preparing him for this. Putin, on the other hand, he is a dominant leader in the region, and he shows a stance in this war, and he always tries to give the impression that he is someone who is ready to have a deal. He's not always making them, but he demonstrates that he's there. with his communication and with the narrative that the Kremlin demonstrates that they were ready to negotiate and they were ready to bargain a deal, but that was the U.S. administration who was not able to take their fears and interests into account. Then by giving Putin a hand, I think Trump works a little bit against his opponents in the Democratic Party, showing that if he would be the president or if he would be in charge, then he would be able to contain the Russian aggression within the boundaries in between which it would be easier to handle them. So I think this balance that you mentioned, correctly mentioned, is a part of a bargaining deal to pat Putin's head a little bit to make him more agreeable, and on the other hand, to be a bit more harsh on Zelensky is to humble him a bit and be able to conduct the deal that would secure that his promises and during the campaign were not just empty words, but he is actually a real deal breaker. I think what really matters is how he will behave after the conflict will be solved, how he will then handle the Ukrainian leadership and how he will handle the Russian ones. Because today I think this is a game that aims to reach some sort of an agreement that was promised during the campaign. And we are very close to that 100-day deadline that he promoted, and we are far from the deal now, or at least now.
I'm going to ask you to get out your crystal ball again and maybe discuss a little bit about the dimensions when the war ends and however the borders are redrawn. What are the costs of recovery and how are those costs going to be covered, whether it's industrial infrastructure, agricultural infrastructure, just the environmental damage caused by the war?
Ukraine suffered significant losses, and these are really terrible losses. Not to mention the territorial losses, which is around 20% of the entire territory of Ukraine. But we can add at least 10% of Ukraine's territory outside of the 20% we occupied that are contaminated with explosives and mines. They say that Ukraine today is the most mined country in the world, and it would take up to 40 years to eliminate this contamination of the land. This has a very serious effect on the agricultural potential of Ukraine, and yet we don't know how it will be rebuilt. Still, Ukraine's agriculture runs, and it gives 10% of Ukraine's GDP, even under the conditions of the war. So Ukraine still gives out a significant export of grains globally. But on the other hand, the Ukrainian industries that were very significant, heavy industry especially, so the metallurgy, chemical industry, many of the Ukrainian chemical industries produced noble gases like neon, for example, that is used in the green hydrogen, and many of these gases are being used in the renewable energy projects. Like, for example, solar panels are made with these gases over there. These factories are devastated. If they're not, they're under Russian control. At least 60% of Ukraine's energy producing infrastructure is also damaged and destroyed. The largest nuclear power plant is under Russian control. So there are significant losses, and there's at least 8 million people who fled the country. So at this point, we don't know what the numbers are going to be on the recovery, and we don't know what are going to be the main industries that will be rebuilt after the war will end. In my opinion, the very first ones should be the energetic infrastructure, the energy infrastructure facilities, because without energy, the industries will not run. The next step is going to be the demining and the agriculture. And when this will be put in place, then we will see how the heavy industries will be rebuilt. If this mineral deal will be signed, then it will be very hard for Ukraine to deal with the reconstructions, because 50%, as per this agreement, of the benefits coming from the mining of these rare earths and other minerals will go to the US and the rest will remain within the Fund of Reconstruction. But then we don't know what decisions this fund will take in order to pick the industries that will be rebuilt. There will be 5 people in the council, 3 of which will be Americans, and 2 will be Ukrainians who must be agreed by the Americans. So we don't know how it will go. Again, if this will be signed, so we don't know how it will be. This is the hard part. And then we have the softer part or the humanitarian part of it. There is no plan in Ukraine how to get back those 8 million people to Ukraine, which will lead to significant problems in terms of labor force. The Institute of Demography in Ukraine calculated that it might need 300,000 migrants or guest workers for 10 years in order to replace all the missing labor force that will be needed during the reconstruction, which we don't know how will be conducted. And from, again, social point of view, there is no plan on the reintegration and rehabilitation of the military personnel that is now involved in the war. There is 800,000 people under rifles today, and there is no clear vision on their rehabilitation and their reintegration to the society. In 2015, after the ceasefire deal was signed with the Russians and breakaway territories in Ukraine, there was only maybe 20,000 people involved in this conflict. But even that created serious problems in Ukraine. The amount of violent crimes rised a lot, and there was a huge amount of firearms circulating in the black market of Ukraine. So now imagine what it will be if there will be 800,000 people coming back from the fronts. So yeah, the crystal ball is very gloomy and blurry at this point.
Connecting to that question, which I know that this is, I guess, kind of a deeper question because the UN doesn't necessarily always do their job, but I guess, is the UN in any way involved in the Ukraine? Like, if the war were to end and like the UN wanted to like get in there and like help like the military people once they finished, like you said, the military people need to reintegrate into society, or like, you know, the people that lost their houses, to paint some sort of utopian picture, because again, we know that the UN doesn't always do what they're supposed to. Are they in any way involved in the Ukraine? Like, is the Ukraine a part of the UN?
Well, at this point, the UN is concerned about Ukraine.
Yeah, that's why I say that they don't always do their job.
Yeah, but you know, Russia is in the Security Council, so a serious step up by the UN can be vetoed by the Russians at this point. But on the other hand, there were again no serious plans on reconstruction and rebuilding of Ukraine after the war ends, because the very first step is to end it in an acceptable way, which we don't know how it can be conducted and what that acceptable way is. I cannot give a clear answer to that because at this point there are no major steps taken from this direction. We don't even know how if a ceasefire will be conducted, how it will be maintained and how it will be observed. It's 2,000 kilometers, 1,500 miles long front line to be observed between Russia and Ukraine. So this is an important step, but at this point, this is the third step. So we have to take the first and the second in order to be able to talk about how the UN can be involved in this. I believe they will be involved in a way, but the levels and the efficiency of it, well, it's under a huge question at this point. Yeah, a question mark. Yeah. Yep. Do you have somewhere there?
Oh, an online.
So far, you only talked about Zelensky and Putin. But if we really look at the daily events, we will see that Poland has some role. We also have Lukashenko in the area. Time Erdogan stands up and says something about the region or the conflict. How are these additional players muddy the water and/or add additional colors to the balance?
Well, Turkey's role over here is quite comfortable for Erdogan, I would say, because he was able to, on one hand, provide military support and equipment to Ukraine, especially attack drones that were very efficient in the first months of the war. On the other hand, Turkey acts as the biggest hub of reselling of Russian fossil fuels, like the crude oil, the LNG, the pipeline gas, is something that's being resold through Turkey. Even Russian gas from Turkey reaches even the U.S. So we saw articles in Washington Post where we can read that Russian crude hits American ports via Turkey. So for Erdogan, this is a very good possibility to get some extra money from both sides. On one hand, on the other hand, he played twice the role of the mediator of this conflict in the very first round of negotiations in 2022, and then it was said also that Turkey may play a role in the later rounds of negotiations of Ukraine and Russia. Some say it even can play a role as a peacekeeper in Ukraine when the ceasefire will be done. We don't know. It will be very tricky because Turkey is a NATO member, and this would put some questions whether NATO involvement is a no-go zone for Putin or not. Lukashenko in this game is a minor actor, in my opinion. He provided his territory for the Russian forces to go through, but not participated in any hostilities and not participated in any conflicts with Ukraine. Plus, Belarus accepted over 300,000 Ukrainian refugees who are now living in Belarus, and they are not necessarily from eastern parts of Ukraine. So he is trying to be the voice of common sense over there, but he doesn't have much space to maneuver because he's tied too strongly to Russia, and he is under the same sanctions as the Russian regime is. So he cannot really open to the Western partners because he's unwanted over there. So his role in this conflict is really minor. Coming to the Poles, well, the Poles, with their very active and very strong position on containing and defeating Russia, can get some leading roles in the EU, but at this point they don't really have the economic power to replace Germany, which they want. That's why their policies are so linked to the policy making in London and in the US. But from point of view of Ukraine, they also have concerns with it. If you talk to Polish experts who are dealing with Ukraine seriously, they have serious concern with Ukrainian policymaking from point of view of history, with very hard relations with Poland and Ukraine from the Volyn massacre and the new hero building of Ukraine. So, for example, those heroes who are now being praised in Ukraine, like Bandera, Shukhevich, they're someone who are banned in Poland. And many of these experts say that Ukrainians will not yell Slava Ukraini in Poland. So while the Ukrainian nationalism is spearheaded towards the Russians, it's okay. But when the Russian problem will be eliminated, then we're going to take care of the Ukrainian nationalism within our hands. So I don't think that Poland is now the best friend of Ukraine. It is a supporter of Ukraine, but I wouldn't say that they are friends of Ukraine. From point of view of the European matters, Poland can get some positive outcomes of this war by strengthening its position. And with the deal that they signed with South Korea on building those Korean tanks in Poland, would give them a leverage when the European rearmament programs will be starting, because Poland can provide the armored vehicles and tanks to the European armies by the Korean technology that will be placed in Poland. So they can get some leverage from that. But that's not because of they love Ukraine or something. They love Poland, and this is what they do, and it's the right thing to do.
Do you have a sense for how the Russian people themselves feel about the invasion and serving in such a seemingly unpopular war?
Again, a tough question. If you read interviews or watch the polls in Russia, then there is an interesting thing because more than 50% of the people there who the experts are asking are saying that the war in Ukraine is not a good thing, but they say that that was the right thing to do. So they're kind of not against the war, but they say that the war must be ended. There is a very strange or rather interesting duality in the Russian society towards the war, because what they say is that they have no hard feelings towards Ukrainians, because they feel that Ukrainians are good people and they're a kin nation to the Russians. But the political leadership of Ukraine is acting not in favor of the Ukrainian nation. So the narrative that the Russians are using is that they are fighting the Ukrainian regime, not the Ukrainian people. So that's how they're trying to balance these things. There was a question in these polls that if the war would end tomorrow, would you support it in this way? And over 70% of the population said, or not the population, but those who were asked, said that they would end the war tomorrow if it would stop where it is. The other question over there was that if the war would stop and you would have to give up the territories that you have, then only 30% said that they would agree to this. And the ideology or the narrative behind that was that we do not want to give up our people in those regions, because if those regions will be controlled by Ukraine again, then the Ukrainian forces are going to do this hunt on witches over there, looking for collaborators and stuff. So it would make serious harm to the people who are living there. So that's the second narrative that they're using. So in Russia, it's very very hard to determine how they feel about this war, because on one hand they feel very sorry about the Ukrainians who are facing the consequences of the war, but on the other hand they also believe that this was the only way to deal with the problem that arise in Ukraine. And the leadership of Ukraine is something that doesn't work in the favor of the Ukrainian population. So they are kind of doing the right thing, even though it's tragic and it's hard. So the propaganda in Russia works well. That's what we can say from this. But what we also can say certainly, with certainty, that there's less hatred in the Russian people. I mean, in the regular Russian people towards the regular Ukrainians in general. So there's not that high level of pure hatred towards Ukrainians. Towards the political leadership it is, but not towards the people. At least that's what you can see from the polls and from the media and from the surveys that are being done in Russia.
Well, thank you. Any more questions? Oh, no, sir. Oh, okay. We had about 5 minutes left, yeah. Is there any other questions?
So after the initial invasion, much of the arguments for both U.S. and EU support for Ukraine was based on the concern that Russia was going to expand if they were allowed to take Ukraine and continue to expand. Is that still a concern, and this is probably for both of you actually, is that still a concern, or has Russia's missteps and clearly lack of ability to conquer this land, has that dissuaded or has subsided a little bit of these concerns? Part of that discussion is not in U.S. politics now. Mostly it's about money and how much we're spending on it.
I think that the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the Russian threat in general is a very comfortable excuse for many capitals in Europe, and not only in Europe, to refocus the attention of the society from the criticism towards them, towards existential threat that comes from the East. In my opinion, we have to get rid of this duality on the Russians, because if you run through the media dealing with the war in Ukraine, you can see either texts that are saying that Ukrainians or the Russians are losers and they're incapable of taking over Ukraine, and the Ukrainians are kicking their asses without any problems. So you just give them a little bit of arms, a little bit of money, and they will burn the Kremlin to the ground. And then the very next article is that we have to support Ukraine, because if not, then the Russian forces are going to march into Berlin, and the next day they will sipping Guinness in London. The two cannot work together. So they're either losers who cannot take over Ukraine, or they're either an existential threat that can take over the entire continent. If they would be the second, then I think we would not talking about ceasefire in Ukraine today, right? So it is a mobilization factor for many European societies and European decision makers to mobilize the society, to give excuse of cutting the social expenses and relocate them to other businesses and industries, which would lead to extra profits to certain players. But I think deep in their hearts they know that the physical threat of Russian soldiers marching in Europe is not that possible, because if that would be the case, then nuclears would be used, and if the nukes will be used, then no boots on the ground can be, and no other boots in any ground can be in Europe. So in this regard, building tanks is not necessarily the best case. I think at this point. Keeping the Russian threat on the agenda is more a political thing rather than a realistic one. It is necessary because we have to understand that Russia will not go away. So it's on the continent. We cannot move it out from the continent, and the European capitals must be ready to contain it if things will happen. But at this point, I cannot see the logic and the reason behind it, why Russians would do it. So if they would go in, how they would keep it, how they would sustain it, it's not something that the Russians are capable of at this point.
Yeah, I see. Yeah, I share your vision, because what I can see is that for many European politicians, Russia is a good boogeyman. But with that said, I don't want to underestimate, let's say, like Russian influence, in Europe, outside of EU countries and inside of it, because Russia supports certain political actors or parties, cultural and religious organizations, through which it can influence its power. But that power is not enough to break out a war either in the Western Balkans or anywhere else in Europe. The main aim of Russia, I would say, is to keep the current status quo and to be able to sometimes, make some troubles. But when it comes to, let's say, like an active military conflict, Russia is definitely not in a position to do any harm to Europe. And I think Ukraine's example is a good example to that, because what Russia expected in the first days of the full-scale invasion, I mean, they prepared for a 1-week war or something like that, they would be greeted in Kiev with salt
flowers,
and
exactly.
Salt and bread,
Yeah.
Exactly. Russia prepared for a 3-day war, and here we are after 3 years.
Yeah, they had a strategic miscalculation with that, and they were preparing for a scenario of Crimea. And what Ferry mentioned is very important about the soft power of Russians, that they are trying to stir up the things in the European countries by supporting various political groups and religious organizations or whatever. I have been a very good conversation with the Russian expert who was talking about the vision of Putin, how he believes Europe should look like, and there was a very interesting thought in that, meaning that Putin would like to see a responsible, strong Europe, but by responsible, strong, he would mean that Europe would be brave enough, or vulgarly said, had the balls to buy the Russian stuff, even though the Americans don't like it, is able to conduct its so act as a political actor, which Putin thinks Europe is not anymore. So he doesn't consider Europe as a political actor, and he believed that Europe was a political actor when leaders like Helmut Kohl was in charge. Yeah, so that was come from there. So, or when people were there and saying, okay, so we don't like the Russians, but let's have a detente. So let's go back to another Harmel moment, and let's build the pipelines. Let's do business. They are a dictatorship, whatever. So be it. We don't interfere in their things. They don't interfere in our things. Let's just make money together, and everybody's happy with it. So. I think these malign influences that Ferry was mentioning is actually to putting the leverage in the hands or giving cards to those groups that, if in power, would impersonate this kind of European acting that would favor Putin's Russia. So I think that's something there. This is a concern. So this has to be taken care of. But the military element in it, it's not there yet.
Well, I would like to thank you both so much. I thought this was a fascinating conversation, and I would like to thank all of you for joining us and all of you online who joined us. And I feel like, despite the fact that you were kind of Debbie Downers, we owe you a round of applause and some thank yous. So thank you very much.